The worst part about coming home during tornado season wasn't the storm. It was realizing some disasters had blue eyes and remembered exactly how you broke them. The rain started somewhere past mile marker 42, a slow tap against Ethan Brooks' windshield that felt almost polite at first, like the sky was asking permission before ruining his night. By mile 31, polite was long gone. Sheets of rain slammed against his beat-up silver Honda hard enough to blur the road into smeared yellow lines and ghostly headlights, while the old radio crackled between static and increasingly aggressive weather alerts. National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for Hays County until 9:45 p.m. Residents are advised to seek immediate shelter. Of course you did, Ethan muttered to the universe, tightening both hands on the wheel like that might somehow keep his life from spinning out the same way it had 3 years ago. Hays Creek appeared through the storm like a memory he'd tried to bury and failed. The wooden welcome sign, home of the Hawks, leaned slightly sideways now, weather-worn and familiar in the cruelest way. Ethan hadn't planned to stop. Technically, he wasn't stopping. His plan had been simple: drive in, sign the final paperwork on his late aunt's property, spend one miserable night at the old house on Birch Street, and leave before sunrise. No reunions. No memories. No Caleb Hays. Especially no Caleb Hays. But apparently, the universe had a dark sense of humor and excellent timing. His gaslight blinked on just as the storm turned biblical. "You have got to be kidding me." Ethan laughed then, that dry, slightly hysterical laugh people make when life is one inconvenience away from becoming performance art. He spotted Dalton's gas and go off Route 8, its flickering neon sign somehow still surviving against sideways rain and 80-mile-per-hour wind gusts. The convenience store looked exactly the same. Same rusted ice machine. Same sad soda posters peeling off the windows. Same eerie feeling that stepping inside might somehow shove him backward through time. Ethan pulled in fast, hoodie over his head, and sprinted through puddles deep enough to soak through his sneakers instantly. Rain hit like thrown gravel. His duffel bag smacked against his side. By the time he shoved through the glass door, breathing hard and dripping onto the stained tile floor, he looked less like a man returning home and more like a cautionary tale. The bell above the door jingled. And then everything, every sarcastic thought, every survival instinct, every carefully built emotional wall, absolutely shattered. Because leaning against the coffee station, holding a paper cup like he had all the time in the world, was Caleb Hays. 6'3", broad shoulders, dark brown hair somehow still annoyingly perfect despite the storm. Flannel sleeves shoved to his elbows. And those eyes, those impossible, devastating blue eyes Ethan used to know better than his own reflection. Caleb looked up slowly, their gazes locked. Time didn't stop. That would have been too kind. No, time stretched, thin and painful, like a bruise pressed on purpose. Caleb's expression didn't change right away, which somehow hurt worse. Just one blink. Then another. "Well," he said finally, voice deeper than Ethan remembered, and somehow sharper too. "Guess tornadoes really do bring back things people thought were gone." Ethan actually forgot how breathing worked for a second. Because there it was. Not shouting. Not anger. Worse. That cold, cutting humor Caleb only used when something still mattered enough to hurt. Outside, thunder cracked so hard the windows rattled. Inside, Ethan stood frozen in soaked clothes and old regret, suddenly 17 again, suddenly breathless, suddenly one terrible decision away from disaster. And judging by the way Caleb straightened and set his coffee down like the storm outside had become significantly less dangerous than the one standing in front of him, disaster had officially arrived. For one surreal, deeply cursed second, Ethan genuinely considered pretending he was someone else. Maybe a distant cousin. Maybe a rain-soaked drifter with tragic hair and no emotional baggage. Unfortunately, Caleb Hays had always been exceptionally good at recognizing him. Even after 3 years, one heartbreak, and approximately 900 miles of avoidance. "You look like hell," Caleb said, and there it was again, that brutal, effortless talent for sounding insulting and concerned at the exact same time. Ethan pushed wet hair out of his eyes and dropped his duffel by the door with more attitude than grace. "Nice to see you too, Caleb." The cashier, Mr. Duffy, glanced up from behind the counter with all the exhausted energy of a man who had seen enough small-town drama to know when to mind his business. He quietly turned up the weather radio instead. Smart man. Caleb took a slow sip of coffee, like he had not just shattered Ethan's fragile plan to survive this town unnoticed. Did not say it was nice, he replied. Ethan should not have noticed that Caleb still drank his coffee black when stressed. He definitely should not have noticed the new scar near Caleb's jawline or the way his flannel clung damply to his shoulders from rain. Most importantly, he absolutely should not have noticed that familiar ache in his chest, that awful little crackle of something unfinished. Still charming, Ethan muttered, moving toward the snack aisle mostly because putting physical objects between himself and Caleb felt safer. Still leave without saying goodbye? Caleb shot back immediately. Oh, fantastic. Straight to emotional arson. Ethan stopped so abruptly, he nearly walked face first into a display of beef jerky. Outside, thunder boomed loud enough to shake the glass doors. Inside, silence hit harder. There were 1,000 responses Ethan could have chosen. Defensive ones, angry ones, clever ones. Instead, his traitorous brain supplied only memories. Caleb at 16, grinning with grass stains on his jeans. Caleb teaching him how to drive stick shift in the abandoned school parking lot. Caleb on that last night, standing on Birch Street while Ethan packed up his father's car and could not bear to explain why leaving felt like survival. Ethan swallowed hard. I did not come back for this. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a second, something raw flickered beneath all that sharpened sarcasm. Hurt. Real old hurt. But before either of them could say something truly catastrophic, the emergency siren outside wailed. Loud. Mechanical. Bone deep. Every phone in the store blared with the same shrill alert. Tornado warning. Seek shelter immediately. Ethan flinched on instinct, his stomach dropping somewhere near his shoes. The lights flickered once. Twice. Then the wind hit. Not rain. Not thunder. Wind. A monstrous, roaring sound like the whole sky had decided to come apart. Backroom. Now, Mr. Duffy shouted. The front windows shuddered violently. Somewhere outside, metal screeched. Ethan turned toward the door, toward his car, his bag, his papers, because apparently his survival instincts were still occasionally overridden by stupidity. My keys, Ethan. Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. Not loud. Worse. Sharp with the kind of fear that did not ask politely. Ethan barely had time to look up before Caleb was there, grabbing his wrist with startling force and yanking him backward just as something outside slammed against the building hard enough to explode glass across the front entrance. Ethan gasped, stumbling straight into Caleb's chest as the store plunged into chaos. Are you out of your mind? Caleb snapped, one arm locked around Ethan like letting go was not an option. I was getting my car. It is a car. Caleb practically dragged him down the narrow hallway toward the underground storm shelter, wind howling behind them. You, he said, breathless and furious and sounding far too shaken for this to be casual, are significantly harder to replace. And maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was adrenaline. Or maybe it was the terrifying sincerity buried under all that panic. But Ethan forgot how to argue after that. The storm shelter door slammed shut behind them with a metallic bang that sounded far too final for Ethan's comfort. 1 second there had been wind, shattered glass, and Caleb's hand locked around his wrist like a lifeline with anger issues. The next, there was darkness. Not complete darkness, exactly. More like dim, dusty half-light from a single battery-powered lantern hanging crookedly on a concrete wall. Enough to see shapes. Enough to recognize disaster. The shelter was small, smaller than Ethan remembered from childhood tornado drills. Cinderblock walls, metal shelves lined, with dusty canned beans, bottled water, and enough emergency supplies to suggest Hayes Creek had trust issues with weather. A folding chair, a cracked radio, and, because the universe was committed to ruining Ethan specifically, Caleb Hayes standing directly in front of him, chest rising hard, one hand still gripping Ethan's hoodie like if he let go for even half a second, Ethan might sprint headfirst back into catastrophe. You can let go now, Ethan said, though his voice came out thinner than intended. Caleb did not. No, he said immediately. Ethan blinked. No. Caleb's jaw flexed, rainwater still dripping from his hair onto his flannel collar. You nearly ran into a tornado for a Honda Civic. It is a reliable car. Caleb stared at him for one long, deeply unimpressed second. I cannot believe I used to think you were the smart one. Under different circumstances, Ethan might have laughed. Actually, against all logic, part of him still wanted to. Because there it was again, that same unbearable rhythm they had always fallen into. Bickering like breathing. Sarcasm as survival. Like 3 years had not happened. Like Ethan had not disappeared. Like Caleb had not spent all this time turning pain into sharp edges. Outside, the storm howled louder, the sound vibrating faintly through the underground walls. It felt unnatural, like standing inside the lungs of something enormous and angry. The lantern flickered. Ethan hated how quickly his body reacted. His shoulders tensed. His breath caught, just slightly. Small enough that most people would not notice. Caleb noticed. Of course he did. Caleb's expression shifted, not softened exactly, but sharpened differently. Less fury. More focus. "Hey," he said quietly. Ethan hated that too. Hated how one word from Caleb still carried enough history to knock the air sideways in his chest. "I am fine." "Sure," Caleb replied, in the universal tone of someone absolutely not believing that nonsense. Finally, Caleb released Ethan's hoodie, but only to guide him, gently, somehow more infuriatingly, to the folding chair against the wall. "Sit down before your dramatic survival instincts get worse." "I am not dramatic." Caleb actually laughed then. Brief. Disbelieving. Painfully familiar. "Brooks, you once cried because a stray dog ignored you." He was having a hard summer. The laugh vanished too quickly, leaving behind something heavier. Caleb crouched in front of Ethan before he could overthink that deeply inconvenient visual. Close enough to check the shallow cut near Ethan's temple from flying glass. Close enough that Ethan could smell rain, coffee, and something achingly, devastatingly Caleb. "Hold still," Caleb muttered. "You are bleeding." "It is barely a scratch." "You always say that," Caleb said, and there it was again. That sentence was not about the cut. Ethan went still. Caleb used a clean cloth from the first aid kit, his fingers careful in a way that felt wildly unfair after years of silence. Ethan should have pulled away. Probably. Instead, he sat there like his common sense had evacuated with the rest of the town. "You do not get to act like you still know me," Ethan said softly, because if he did not say something, the tenderness might actually destroy him. Caleb's hand stopped. For one brutal second, the storm outside was quieter than whatever passed between them. Then Caleb looked up, those impossible blue eyes storm-dark and honest in ways Ethan was not remotely prepared for. "That is the problem," he said, voice rougher now. "I never stopped." And just like that, the air in the shelter changed. Ethan genuinely wished Caleb had said almost anything else. An insult? Manageable. Sarcasm. Familiar territory. Even, "You still owe me $20 from junior year," would have been preferable to "I never stopped," because that, unfortunately, catastrophically, was not something Ethan's nervous system knew how to file under safe. So naturally, like the emotionally repressed disaster he had always been, Ethan did what he did best when confronted with unbearable sincerity. He deflected. "That," Ethan said, clearing his throat while staring very hard at a shelf full of canned peaches like they might offer spiritual guidance, "is an incredibly weird thing to say while I am bleeding in a basement." Caleb exhaled something dangerously close to a laugh, but there was no real humor in it. Just exhaustion. The kind that sat in the bones. "You are impossible." And yet, Ethan muttered, because apparently self-preservation had fully left the building, "You are still here." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Worse. The loaded kind. The kind that pressed against old wounds and unfinished sentences. Outside, the storm roared like it was trying to tear the whole county off the map. Inside, Ethan became acutely aware of everything he did not know how to handle. Like how Caleb was still crouched in front of him, too close. One hand braced lightly against Ethan's knee for balance without either of them acknowledging it. Or how those stupid blue eyes looked less angry now and more tired. Hurt in places sarcasm could not cover. "Yeah," Caleb said finally, so quietly Ethan almost missed it beneath the thunder. "I am still here." The words hit harder than they should have. Because Ethan had spent 3 years convincing himself Caleb moved on. That maybe hatred would be easier for Caleb than grief. That leaving without explanation had at least given one of them a cleaner wound. Looking at him now, Ethan realized what a spectacular lie that had been. The radio on the supply shelf crackled suddenly, making them both jolt. Mr. Duffy's strained voice pushed through static. If anyone is in Shelter B, stay put. Main roads are blocked. Repeat, stay underground until further notice. Shelter B, perfect. Even the apocalypse had assigned them matching emotional torture coordinates. Caleb stood then, finally putting a few blessed inches of space between them, though somehow that felt worse. Ethan watched him drag a hand through damp hair before pacing once across the narrow concrete floor. Once. Back. Like a caged thought. So, Caleb said, arms crossing, you were just going to show up, sell the house, and vanish again? Oh, there it was. The real storm. Ethan's stomach dropped. I was not vanishing. Caleb's laugh this time was sharp enough to cut paper. Right? Because historically, your exits have been incredibly well communicated. You do not know why I left. Ethan had not meant to snap, but the words came out brittle anyway. Caleb stopped pacing. Then tell. Me. Simple. Direct. Brutal. Ethan opened his mouth. Closed it. Because where exactly was he supposed to start? With his father finding out about them? With shouting in the kitchen and shattered picture frames and threats wrapped in Southern politeness? With the ultimatum that had sounded less like parenting and more like exile? Leave now, or Caleb's future pays for it too. Ethan's chest tightened. It was complicated. Caleb's jaw flexed so hard Ethan could practically hear it. No, Caleb said, voice suddenly low and far too steady. Complicated is algebra. Complicated is tax forms. You disappearing the week after you promised me you were not going anywhere. He looked away for exactly 1 second, and somehow that hurt more than if he had yelled. That was not complicated, Ethan. That was cruel. Ethan forgot how to breathe, because Caleb had every right to say it. And the worst part? Ethan had said it to himself 1,000 times already. The lantern flickered again. Thunder shook dust from the ceiling. But none of it compared to the awful, aching fracture opening in Ethan's chest, because for the first time since coming back, he was no longer trapped underground with his enemy. He was trapped with the boy he had once loved enough to leave for, and the man who still had no idea why. Ethan had spent 3 years imagining this conversation. In some versions, Caleb screamed. In others, he laughed, that cold, disbelieving laugh people use when pain calcifies into something sharper. Sometimes Caleb did worse. Sometimes he looked at Ethan like none of it had ever mattered. Ethan had prepared for anger. He had rehearsed resentment. He had even, on particularly self-destructive nights, convinced himself he deserved indifference. What he had absolutely not prepared for was this. Caleb standing 10 feet away in a storm shelter, looking devastated enough to make Ethan feel like his own ribcage had turned traitor. Cruel. The word did not echo so much as settle, heavy and exact, into every place Ethan had already carved it himself. Outside, wind screamed through Hayes Creek like something grieving. Inside, Ethan stared at the concrete floor because looking directly at Caleb suddenly felt like trying to stare into the sun after years underground. You think I do not know that? Ethan asked quietly. Caleb's expression shifted, not softer, exactly, but less sharpened by fury and more by confusion. Ethan laughed then, except it came out hollow and wrong. You think there was a single day I did not wake up feeling like the worst person alive? Then why? Caleb's voice cracked on the word, and somehow that tiny fracture hurt more than all the anger before it. Why, Ethan? There it was. No sarcasm. No defenses. Just a question Caleb should have been allowed to ask 3 years ago. Ethan's hands shook. Fantastic. Dramatic, inconvenient timing. He clasped them together anyway, like maybe pressure alone could keep old memories from splitting open. Because my father found out. The silence that followed was so immediate, so complete. Even the storm outside felt distant for half a breath. Caleb did not move. Found out what? Ethan actually smiled at that, small and bitter and heartbreakingly tired. Us. Caleb went still in a way Ethan had only seen once before, senior year, when their football coach had nearly caught them holding hands under the bleachers. Except back then, stillness had been teenage fear. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that came right before something inside a person rearranged itself permanently. Ethan swallowed hard. He read my messages. Saw the photos. He came into my room screaming like loving you was some kind of disaster I had personally invented. The words came faster now, like once the dam cracked, there was no point pretending. He said if I stayed, he would make sure everyone knew. Your scholarship board. Your coach. Your parents. He said Hayes Creek forgives a lot, but not that. Caleb's face drained of color. Ethan kept going anyway, because stopping now would kill him quicker. He gave me a choice. Leave with him that night. No explanation, no contact. Or stay and watch him burn your future down beside mine. Caleb blinked once. Twice. So you decided for me. It was not an accusation. That was somehow worse. Ethan's breath caught. I was 17. So was I. Ethan flinched like the words had physical weight. Fair. God, fair. I know, Ethan whispered. I know. Thunder cracked overhead hard enough to rattle the lantern. Somewhere above them, something heavy scraped across pavement. But Ethan barely heard it over the sound of his own regret. I thought I was protecting you. Caleb looked away then, laughing once under his breath. Not because anything was funny, but because sometimes pain overflowed weirdly. You really do not get it, he said, and for the first time, his anger sounded smaller than his heartbreak. I did not need you to protect me from the world, Ethan. His eyes lifted then, blue and wrecked, and far too honest. I needed you to trust me enough to stand next to me in it. And there it was. The truth Ethan had spent 3 years outrunning, only to find it waiting underground in a storm with the boy he had loved, the man he still did, and the devastating realization that sometimes leaving to save someone still counted as breaking them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside still raged like the sky had unresolved issues, but down in Shelter B, silence somehow felt louder. He needed you to trust me enough to stand next to me in it. Ethan had heard painful truths before. His father had specialized in them, usually dressed up as discipline or morality or what is best for this family. But Caleb's version was different. It did not bruise because it was cruel. It bruised because it was true. Ethan sat there on that sad folding chair, soaked hoodie clinging to his skin, years of guilt pressing against his ribs like they had finally decided to collect rent. I was trying to keep you safe, he said, and even to his own ears, it sounded young. Fragile. Like something 17-year-old Ethan had repeated enough times to survive becoming 20. Caleb's jaw tightened, but not in anger this time. More like restraint. I know, he said, which honestly was not the response Ethan deserved, and somehow made everything worse. Caleb scrubbed both hands over his face, pacing once again like if he stopped moving, whatever he was holding back might actually break loose. That is what kills me, Ethan. His voice was rough now, stripped clean of sarcasm. I know why you thought you were doing it. I know you were scared. But do you have any idea what it did to me? Ethan's throat closed. Because yes. Probably not fully. But enough. Caleb stopped pacing near the far wall, staring at the concrete like it had personally offended him. For months, I thought I did something wrong. Ethan physically recoiled. Caleb, do not. Not shouted. Softer. Sharper. Caleb looked up, and Ethan swore that somehow hurt more than fury ever could. Do not interrupt this part, because you left me with nothing but my own imagination, and trust me, it got creative. Ethan went still. I replayed every conversation, every stupid joke, every kiss, every time you looked at me like I mattered. His laugh was brief and broken around the edges. I thought maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe you woke up and realized I was just some mistake you made in a small town before your real life started. You were never a mistake. Ethan did not mean to say it that fast. Did not mean for it to sound so immediate. So wrecked. But there it was, hanging between them like something alive. Caleb's entire expression changed. Not fixed. Not healed. Just shaken. Ethan stood then, because sitting felt impossible and distance suddenly felt worse. You were the realest thing that ever happened to me. Caleb blinked hard, and for one surreal second, Ethan wondered if tornado shelters came equipped for emotional collapse. Then why did it feel so easy for you to disappear? Ethan's chest caved inward. It did not. His voice cracked, and fine, great, apparently dignity was also weather-related now. Caleb, I threw up in a gas station bathroom in Tennessee because my dad took my phone and I realized I did not even know your number by memory. Caleb's eyes widened slightly. I wrote you letters for almost a year. Silence. What? Ethan laughed once, bitter and small. 43, actually. I kept mailing them to my aunt here because I thought maybe someday. He shook his head. I never sent them. I was too scared he would find out. Too scared I would ruin your life all over again just because I missed you. The lantern flickered. Thunder rolled. And Caleb Hayes, stubborn, impossible Caleb, looked at Ethan like someone had just handed him a grief he never knew existed. 43, he repeated, quieter now. Ethan nodded, suddenly fascinated by the floor again. Most of them were terrible. A lot of dramatic metaphors. At least 6 were just me apologizing. For the first time in what felt like years, Caleb's mouth twitched. Not a full smile. More like muscle memory, trying to remember joy. You always were obnoxiously wordy. Ethan let out a startled breath that almost qualified as laughter. And you always hated punctuation. Still do. It was small. Tiny even. But something shifted. Not fixed. Not forgiven. Just less broken than 5 minutes ago. Then, because apparently the universe refused to let them process emotions without chaos, the shelter lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. Ethan inhaled sharply on instinct. And before panic could fully form, Caleb's hand found his in the dark. Immediate. Certain. Like despite everything, years, grief, anger, storms, some part of him still knew exactly where Ethan was. Darkness changed everything. Not metaphorically. Not in some poetic, healing through symbolism kind of way. Ethan meant literal, pitch black, stomach-dropping darkness. The kind that erased concrete walls, storm shelves, old wounds, and every carefully maintained inch of emotional distance in a single breath. 1 second, Shelter B had been dim and tense and painfully full of unresolved history. The next, it was just thunder, breathing, and Caleb's hand around his. Warm, firm, immediate. Ethan froze, which, in his defense, felt like a pretty reasonable response when the boy who once broke your heart by existing too perfectly and the man currently rebuilding it through sheer inconvenient consistency suddenly laced your fingers together in complete darkness like muscle memory had never gotten the memo to move on. Hey, Caleb said quietly, his voice closer now. Too close. Breathe. Ethan would later blame the storm for how violently his chest betrayed him, because apparently his lungs, much like the rest of him, still listened when Caleb Hayes told them what to do. I am breathing, Ethan whispered. That was a lie, Caleb replied instantly. And there it was. Somehow, impossibly, even in total darkness and emotional ruin, Caleb still sounded like himself. Ethan laughed then, small, shaky but real. You are insufferable. And yet, Caleb said, voice gentler now, you are holding my hand like I am the only thing keeping you from losing it. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, because, objectively, annoyingly, that was difficult to argue with. Another thunderous roar shook the shelter, this one louder, closer, like the storm had decided personal boundaries were optional. Something heavy thudded above ground. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Ethan flinched before he could stop himself, and Caleb's grip tightened immediately. Not possessive, protective. The difference nearly wrecked him. Come here. It was not a command. More like instinct with a pulse. Before Ethan's pride could invent a terrible decision, Caleb was already guiding him carefully through the dark until Ethan's shoulder bumped solidly against Caleb's chest. Warm flannel. Damp cotton. Familiar in ways Ethan had absolutely no business surviving. This is temporary, Ethan muttered, because denial was free and apparently still his first language. Caleb's quiet laugh rumbled somewhere above him. Sure. I mean it. Absolutely. You sound smug. I am holding together remarkably well for someone currently trapped underground with the human equivalent of unresolved trauma. Ethan should not have smiled. He definitely should not have felt that smile crack something open in his chest. But there, in the dark, with the storm raging overhead and Caleb's arms steady around him, the impossible happened. Ethan felt 17 and 20 all at once. Broken then. Broken now. But maybe, horrifyingly, beautifully, not beyond repair. I used to come here after you left. Caleb's voice changed when he said it. Quieter. Less guarded. Ethan went still. What? Thunder rolled again, softer this time, like the storm itself was finally listening. During storms, Caleb said. Or when my parents were fighting. Or when I just, he exhaled slowly. Needed somewhere the memories did not feel so loud. Ethan's throat tightened. Why here? Caleb was quiet for so long, Ethan wondered if he would answer at all. Then, because this was where you kissed me for the first time. Oh no. Not because it was bad. Worse. Because Ethan remembered. Freshman year. Tornado drill. Everyone else upstairs after the all clear while Ethan and Caleb had lingered behind metal shelves. 16, and terrified, and laughing too hard over canned ravioli. Caleb had made some dumb joke about dying before graduation. Ethan, running entirely on nerves and affection and weather-induced recklessness, had kissed him just to shut him up. It had lasted maybe 2 seconds. Maybe eternity. You remember that? Ethan asked, and wow, cool. Apparently his voice could still do heartbreak in surround sound. Caleb's thumb brushed once across Ethan's knuckles in the dark, so subtle it nearly undid him. Ethan, he said softly, with that devastating certainty only Caleb had ever managed. I remember everything. And for one impossible, terrifying, wondrous second, Ethan realized the storm outside was no longer the thing shaking him most. If Ethan had learned anything in his 20 years of deeply questionable emotional decision-making, it was this. There were few things more dangerous than nostalgia in the dark, especially when nostalgia smelled like rain, old flannel, and the exact person your heart had apparently never updated past. I remember everything. Caleb's words did not just linger. They moved in, settled somewhere under Ethan's ribs beside old letters, missed birthdays, and every version of goodbye that had never actually worked. Which was honestly rude. You really had to say that? Ethan asked eventually, because silence felt too vulnerable, and apparently sarcasm was still cheaper than therapy. Caleb's chest shifted beneath him, just slightly, but enough for Ethan to realize with horrifying clarity that at some point during this emotional catastrophe, he had gone from temporarily leaning for storm-related reasons to actively being tucked against Caleb like this was remotely normal. Great. Excellent. No notes. Say what? Caleb asked, and Ethan could hear the smirk now. Could actually hear it. Unfair. The remember everything part, Ethan muttered. That was aggressively unnecessary. Caleb's laugh came softer this time. Less armor. More ache. Sorry. Next time I will forget our life-altering teenage moments more casually. Ethan should have rolled his eyes. He did, in fact. The problem was Caleb's arm was still around him, and every small movement seemed to remind Ethan's entire nervous system that once upon a time, this had been his safest place, which was frankly inconvenient, given all the unresolved trauma. Above them, the storm shifted. Not gone, just changing. The thunder rolled farther apart now, less furious than before, though rain still battered the ground overhead in relentless waves. Shelterby creaked once, then settled. Ethan noticed because Caleb did. He always had. It is moving east, Caleb said quietly. Ethan blinked into darkness. You can tell that from underground? No, Caleb said. But Mr. Duffy's storm radio has the subtlety of a panic attack, so, right on cue. The emergency radio crackled back to life with a burst of static sharp enough to make Ethan jump. Caleb's hand tightened reflexively. Tornado crossing Route 12, residents remained sheltered, significant structural damage near. Static swallowed the rest. Ethan went cold. Route 12. Birch Street connected to Route 12. My aunt's house. Caleb immediately stiffened. Ethan, the paperwork. Her files, everything. Ethan pushed upright too fast, the sudden movement making the cramped darkness feel sharper. I left all my stuff there. Your stuff? Caleb's voice had that tone now. The one that suggested Ethan was approximately 3 bad choices from supervised living. You are worried about paperwork? It is not just paperwork. Ethan snapped, then regretted it instantly. Because the truth was, it was not about paperwork. Not really. That house was the last piece of someone who had loved him when loving him had been politically inconvenient in the Brooks household. Aunt June had been warmth and peach cobbler and subtle rebellion wrapped in cardigans. She had mailed him birthday money after he left. She had never once asked him to be different. Losing her house felt too much like losing proof he had once been loved without conditions. Caleb must have understood some version of that, because his tone changed immediately. Softer. Hey. One word. Gentle enough to splinter him. We do not know anything yet. Ethan laughed, except it cracked in the middle. That has literally never stopped my anxiety before. Caleb's thumb brushed once over Ethan's sleeve, small, grounding, devastatingly familiar. Then let me try something revolutionary. What? You could, Caleb said carefully, like he was handling something breakable. Stop assuming you have to carry every disaster alone. Ethan forgot how to respond, which, considering his lifelong commitment to emotionally overcomplicated commentary, was saying something. Caleb exhaled slowly. If Birch Street got hit, we deal with it. Simple. Steady. We? Ethan asked before he could stop himself. The words slipped out fragile, hopeful in ways he absolutely did not approve of. Caleb did not hesitate. Yeah, he said, like it was obvious. Like despite storms, years, heartbreak, and all the wreckage in between, some part of him had never once removed Ethan from that equation. We. And God help him. That one word felt more dangerous than the tornado ever had. There should honestly be laws against one small word changing your entire internal climate. We. Caleb said it so simply. No dramatic pause. No grand speech. Just one syllable, steady as concrete. And somehow Ethan's overworked, underhealed heart reacted like it had been struck by weather all over again. Which was absurd. Deeply embarrassing, actually. Because this was Caleb. Caleb Hayes, former best friend, first kiss, catastrophic heartbreak, current storm shelter companion, and apparently still fully capable of rearranging Ethan's emotional furniture with casual pronouns. You cannot just say things like that, Ethan muttered. Caleb, who clearly had not suffered enough, sounded genuinely confused. Like what? Like, Ethan waved vaguely into the darkness because articulating feelings was obviously too much to ask during a natural disaster. That. Caleb was quiet for exactly half a second before. Understanding hit him with what Ethan suspected was deeply annoying clarity. We. The fact that he sounded amused should have been illegal. Yes, we, Ethan hissed. You make it sound. He trailed off, because finishing that sentence required admitting entirely too much. Hopeful. Safe. Like maybe not everything had stayed broken. Caleb's voice softened in that way Ethan was beginning to suspect should come with a warning label. It sounds like you do not have to do this by yourself. Rude. Thoughtful, emotionally devastating, deeply rude. Ethan leaned back against the concrete wall before his knees could fully betray him. You always did have terrible timing. Funny, Caleb said, shifting beside him. I was about to say the same thing about your entire personality. Ethan laughed then. Actually laughed. Not the brittle kind he had been using as armor. Real laughter. It slipped out before grief could stop it, startling both of them into a silence that somehow felt lighter than before. There it is, Caleb said softly. What? That sound. Ethan frowned despite the dark. My laugh. Yeah. Caleb's answer came too quickly to be casual. I forgot how much I missed it. Well, great. Fantastic. Apparently they were just saying devastating things now. Ethan's chest did that traitorous ache again. That awful expansion of something fragile and dangerous and not remotely storm-approved. He opened his mouth, probably to deflect, because growth was clearly too ambitious for one night. But the shelter radio crackled before he could. Storm cell weakening. Emergency crews assessing damage. Residents remained sheltered until official all clear. Caleb exhaled beside him, tension easing by inches. Sounds like the worst of it passed. Ethan nodded automatically before realizing Caleb could not see him. Right. But strangely, neither of them moved. The storm had shifted. The panic had lowered. Technically, this should have been the part where Ethan started rebuilding his emotional walls, preparing for daylight, awkward exits, and the inevitable return of reality. Instead, he sat there in the dark beside the boy he had loved and the man he maybe still did, listening to rain. Soften above ground like the world itself was finally exhaling. Can I ask you something? Caleb said after a while. Ethan's stomach tightened. That depends. Is it emotionally horrifying? Caleb snorted. Probably medium horrifying. Go for it. A pause. Not hesitant. Careful. Why now? Ethan stilled. What? Why come back tonight? Caleb asked quietly. After all this time, why Hayes Creek? Why at June's house? Why during tornado season? Which frankly feels like a personal attack. Ethan should have expected that question. He had, technically. He just had not expected the answer to still hurt this much. Because she died. The words landed heavy and immediate. Caleb went silent. Truly silent. 3 months ago, Ethan continued, voice thinner now. Cancer. I could not get here for the funeral. Shame tasted bitter even years later. Work, flights, excuses. Pick one. Ethan. She left me the house, Ethan said, cutting gently across sympathy before it could wreck him completely. And a letter. Caleb shifted slightly. What did it say? Ethan laughed once, shaky around the edges. Basically, stop running. Some version of you cannot spend your whole life punishing yourself for surviving. The rain softened more. Somewhere above, debris settled. That sounds like her, Caleb murmured, and the quiet fondness in his voice nearly undid Ethan all over again. Aunt June had adored Caleb, called him that pretty, stubborn boy with too much hair. Ethan swallowed hard. She also said if I was ever dumb enough to come back without telling the people I love the truth. He stopped. Then, Caleb asked, voice gentler now. Ethan stared blindly into the dark, pulse suddenly too loud. Then I deserved whatever happened next. Silence. Real silence. Then Caleb shifted closer, just enough that their shoulders touched again, warm and certain. Good thing for you, he said softly. I am starting to think tornadoes count as mercy. If Ethan Brooks had to rank the most emotionally inconvenient things Aunt June had ever done, haunting him with wisdom from beyond the grave would absolutely make the top 3. Right below teaching Caleb Hayes how to make peach cobbler just in case my nephew ever stops pretending he does not need feeding, and calling Ethan out with terrifying accuracy before he had even figured himself out. Good thing for you. I am starting to think tornadoes count as mercy. Ethan should not have smiled at that. He definitely should not have felt warmth uncurl in his chest at the sound of Caleb's voice saying something so absurdly Caleb, dry, gentle, and devastatingly sincere all at once. But he did, because apparently surviving years of heartbreak had not cured him of anything. You know, Ethan said, leaning his head back against cool concrete. Most people send flowers when someone dies. Caleb shifted beside him, shoulders still touching Ethan's like some quietly stubborn promise. And missed the opportunity to emotionally ambush you in a basement? He asked. Absolutely not. Ethan laughed again, softer this time. God, it felt strange. Not bad strange. More like using a muscle long forgotten and realizing it still worked. She really did love you more, Ethan muttered. Caleb made a thoughtful humming sound. To be fair, she had excellent taste. She literally called you that suspiciously handsome menace. And yet, Caleb replied with unbearable calm. She still gave me pie recipes. Ethan turned his head then, not enough to fully see in the dark, but enough to feel the shape of him nearby. Familiar. Steady. Still somehow here. She kept asking about you. Ethan admitted before fear could stop him. Caleb went quiet. The kind of quiet that listened. Even after I left, Ethan continued, voice thinner now. Every phone call. Every birthday card. She never pushed, exactly. Just, he swallowed. She would say things like, funny how unfinished stories always ache louder in storms. Caleb exhaled, and Ethan could practically hear the way that landed. That sounds like her too. Yeah. The word cracked slightly. Ethan hated that. He also hated that Caleb noticed immediately, because apparently some cosmic force had decided this man should remain fluent in Ethan no matter how many years passed. Hey. Caleb's voice dropped lower, gentler. When was the last time you cried about her? Ethan blinked. Excuse me. I am serious. Ethan let out a startled, deeply offended laugh. You cannot just ask emotionally invasive questions like that. I absolutely can, Caleb said. I have known you since you were 12 and cried because Toy Story 3 was psychological warfare. That was a valid reaction. Agreed. Ethan groaned softly, because somehow this was worse, being understood this precisely while grieving. I do not know, he admitted after a while. At the hospital, maybe. Or maybe not even then. The truth sat heavier once spoken. I was so busy being late. So busy feeling guilty for not coming sooner, for not calling enough, for... His voice failed him entirely for a second. I think I skipped the crying part and went straight to functioning badly. Caleb did not rush to fill the silence. Did not offer empty comfort or polished advice. He just stayed, which, historically, had always been his most dangerous quality. She knew, Caleb said eventually. Ethan frowned. Knew what? That you loved her. Simple. Certain. People like June Brooks did not measure love by attendance sheets, Ethan. Ethan's throat tightened so fast it almost hurt. You do not know that. Caleb's answer came immediate. I do. A pause. Then, quieter. Because she said the same thing about you. Ethan went very still. What? Caleb shifted, like maybe even now he was not sure how much to reveal. The summer after you left. I ran into her at Miller's grocery. His voice softened around the memory. I was a complete wreck pretending I was not. She cornered me by frozen vegetables. Despite himself, Ethan snorted. That sounds right. She told me. Caleb continued. And now there was something fragile there too. That leaving did not always mean abandoning. Sometimes it meant someone loved you so much they made the wrong choice for the right reason. Ethan forgot how to breathe. She said that. Yeah. Caleb's voice was rougher now, like memory had edges. Then she smacked me with a loaf of garlic bread and said if I spent my whole life punishing you before hearing the truth, I was an idiot. Ethan stared blindly into the dark for one stunned second before laughter and grief collided so hard in his chest it physically hurt. Oh my God. Caleb laughed too, quieter, sadder. Yeah. For the first time that night, Ethan felt tears burn properly. Not dramatic. Not shattered. Just real. And because the universe apparently believed in poetic cruelty, it happened there, in the dark, underground, beside the one person who had once known how to hold every broken piece of him without asking permission. Ethan had always hated crying in front of people. Not because he thought it made him weak, exactly. More because crying felt like losing custody of yourself in public, and Ethan Brooks had spent most of his life gripping his emotions like they were classified documents. His father had called tears dramatic. His high school football coach had called them distractions. Life, in general, had mostly treated vulnerability like an inconvenience best handled privately. Aunt June, of course, had called that nonsense. If God did not want you to leak feelings occasionally, she had once declared while aggressively frosting cupcakes, he would not have installed tear ducts, sweetheart. Which was honestly a very Aunt June thing to weaponize from a kitchen. And somehow, because the universe adored irony, Ethan finally broke in a storm shelter. Not loudly. Not theatrically. There was no cinematic sobbing or poetic collapse. Just one sharp inhale that did not quite steady. One humiliatingly warm tear escaping before he could negotiate with it. And then another. Oh, come on, Ethan muttered hoarsely, swiping at his face with immediate betrayal. Absolutely not. We are not doing this. Beside him, Caleb was quiet for exactly half a second. You are arguing with your own face, he said gently. Ethan laughed through it, which frankly felt medically confusing. I hate you. No, you do not. Caleb said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that Ethan would have protested if his emotional infrastructure was not currently under renovation. Instead, he made the deeply unfortunate decision to let out one broken sound that was dangerously close to a sob. I really, really hate that you still know that. Something shifted beside him. Not sudden. Not overwhelming. Just, Caleb. Careful in ways. People rarely were with Ethan. Hey, Caleb said softly, and then one large, warm hand gently caught Ethan's wrist before he could keep aggressively pretending his tears were not happening. Stop. Ethan froze. Stop what? Acting like being sad is something you need to apologize for. Well, that was deeply inconsiderate of Caleb to say while Ethan was already losing a battle against basic human emotion. I am not apologizing, Ethan mumbled, which would have been more convincing if his voice had not cracked directly in the middle like an overworked floorboard. Caleb, to his credit, did not call him out. Much. Right, he said. And I am 6 feet tall. Ethan let out a wet, offended laugh. You are literally 6'3". See? Caleb replied softly. You are still capable of honesty under pressure. And there it was again. That impossible thing Caleb had always done. Taking Ethan's worst moments and refusing to let them become unbearable. Not by dismissing them. Not by fixing them. Just by staying until they hurt less. The tears came harder after that, which honestly felt like emotional blackmail. Ethan bent forward, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes in a deeply futile attempt at dignity. I was not there, he whispered finally, and there it was. The real wound. Not just grief. Guilt. Raw and rusted and years in the making. When she needed me most, I was not there. Caleb's answer came immediately. You do not know that. I missed her funeral. That is not the same thing. It feels the same. Silence. Then movement. Slow enough to refuse panic. Gentle enough to undo him entirely. Caleb shifted closer and, with all the certainty of someone choosing this on purpose, pulled Ethan against him. No hesitation. No awkwardness. Just steady arms and familiar warmth and one impossible truth. After everything, Caleb Hayes still held him like something precious instead of broken. Ethan should have fallen apart more gracefully. He did not. His forehead hit Caleb's shoulder. His hands clenched instinctively in damp flannel. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan let someone witness the full, unpolished shape of his grief. "She knew," Caleb murmured into his hair, voice low and unwavering above the softened storm. "Ethan, she knew." How? The word barely existed. Caleb's hand moved once, slow across Ethan's back in a way that felt less like comfort and more like remembering. "Because June loved like you do," he said quietly, loudly, constantly, even from far away. Ethan's breath caught, so hard it hurt. "And people like that." Caleb's voice broke then too, just slightly, honest enough to matter. "They always know." Outside, the storm finally began to pass. But underground, in the arms of the boy he had once lost and maybe never truly had, Ethan cried for his aunt, for himself, for 17, for goodbye, and for the terrifying, fragile possibility that maybe coming home was never about the house at all. There were probably healthier ways to process emotional devastation than crying into your former almost boyfriend's flannel in an underground storm shelter while tornado debris rearranged your hometown. Ethan just could not personally think of any at the moment. In fairness, Caleb's shoulder had always been unfairly reliable. Annoyingly so. Even at 17, when Ethan had been all sharp elbows and secret panic, Caleb had somehow mastered the art of existing like a place instead of a person. Safe. Solid. The human equivalent of finding your phone charger exactly when your battery hit 1%. And apparently, deeply to Ethan's inconvenience, that had not changed. What had changed, unfortunately, was Ethan's complete inability to pretend this did not still matter. Because grief was one thing. Grief while being held by the boy you had once loved enough to leave. That was an entirely different category of emotional nonsense. "You know," Ethan said eventually, voice muffled and wrecked, and still embarrassingly close to Caleb's shoulder. "If you ever tell anyone about this, I will deny everything." Caleb's chest rumbled softly beneath him. Laughing. The audacity. Interesting threat from someone currently using me as a tissue with trust issues. Ethan made a sound of offended dignity that was significantly less intimidating than intended, mostly because it came out hoarse and suspiciously damp. "I am serious." "Sure you are." Caleb's hand, still doing deeply unreasonable things to Ethan's nervous system, moved slowly once between his shoulder blades. Grounding. Familiar. Catastrophic. "Your secret is safe with me, Brooks." A pause. Then, because apparently mercy was not on tonight's menu. Although for the record, this is significantly less embarrassing than 8th grade when you cried because I beat you at Mario Kart and called it emotional sabotage. Ethan lifted his head immediately, scandalized. "First of all, you used Rainbow Road like a war criminal." Caleb's grin was audible now. Actually audible. "Second," Ethan continued, "because principles mattered, you absolutely did sabotage me. Psychologically. By winning. By smirking." Caleb laughed properly then, and wow. Ethan had not been prepared for that. Not the sound itself. He remembered that too well. But the effect. Warm and startled and heartbreakingly familiar, like hearing a song you forgot was once your favorite. It hit Ethan somewhere fragile, somewhere still healing, which was deeply unfair for approximately 6,000 reasons. Slowly, reluctantly, like his pride wanted formal documentation, Ethan pulled back just enough to breathe without directly inhaling Caleb's entire existence. The storm above had softened to rain now. Steady, gentle, almost. Shelterby no longer felt like survival. It felt like suspension, like the whole world had paused just long enough for two idiots with catastrophic timing to finally say the things they should have years ago. Caleb did not move far. His hand stayed light on Ethan's arms, not trapping, just there, like an option. Like maybe Ethan had always mistaken staying for pressure, when sometimes it was just presence. "Hey," Caleb said after a moment, and Ethan hated how one word could still undo him this efficiently. "Yeah." Caleb hesitated, not because he was uncertain, more like he was choosing his honesty carefully, which somehow felt bigger. "I need you to know something." Ethan's pulse immediately made terrible choices. That sentence has never once ended casually. Caleb's mouth twitched, but his eyes, those impossible, infuriatingly sincere eyes, stayed locked on Ethan's even in the dim emergency light that had finally flickered back to life. When you left, he exhaled once, slow. I was angry. For a long time. Ethan nodded, because yes. Obviously. And I tried really hard to hate you. Well, that felt medically concerning. Ethan attempted humor strictly for survival purposes. You say tried like effort was involved. Caleb's thumb brushed absently once near Ethan's sleeve, small enough to miss, impossible to ignore. That is because it was. Ethan forgot every prepared defense he had ever owned. I could not do it, Caleb said simply. No drama. No accusation. Somehow worse. I hated what happened. I hated how much it hurt. I hated not knowing. His voice lowered then, roughened by something old and honest. But I never hated you. Ethan's breath caught, so hard it almost hurt. The rain tapped steadily overhead. The shelter hummed softly around them. And somewhere in the wreckage of grief, guilt, and years gone wrong, something inside Ethan shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but opening. Caleb, I am not saying this because we are trapped underground and you look devastatingly pathetic when you cry, Caleb said, because apparently sincerity still required sarcasm for structural support. I am saying it because if this storm had gone worse tonight, he stopped, swallowed, started again, quieter. I do not think I could survive losing you twice. Ethan stopped breathing entirely this time. Because there it was. Not their first kiss. Not their old heartbreak. Not nostalgia. Something bigger. Present tense. Raw and terrifying and real. And for the first time since returning to Hayes Creek, Ethan realized the scariest part of coming home was never the storm. It was the possibility that Caleb still meant it. Caleb's words did not just land. They detonated quietly. I do not think I could survive losing you twice. Ethan had survived a lot of things in his life. His father's impossible expectations. 3 years of homesickness sharp enough to feel physical. Grief that arrived dressed like paperwork and probate and unanswered phone calls. He had even survived tornado season in Oklahoma, which frankly should qualify anyone for some kind of emotional discount. But this was different. Because surviving heartbreak was one thing. Standing in front of the person who caused it, still loved you through it, and was now looking at you like your existence had always mattered, that required an entirely different skill set, and Ethan was alarmingly underqualified. For one deeply inconvenient second, his brain completely powered down. No sarcasm, no deflection, not even a single emotionally avoidant joke. Just Caleb. Caleb standing too close and somehow not close enough. Rain-soft silence overhead. Emergency lights flickering gold against concrete walls, and those ridiculous blue eyes holding Ethan's like they had every right to ask him to stay. Which, terrifyingly, maybe they did. You cannot just say things like that and expect me to remain psychologically stable, Ethan whispered finally, because apparently honesty was all he had left. Caleb's expression cracked, not into mockery, not into distance, into something almost unbearably fond. I was not aware stability was still an option for either of us. Ethan laughed then, soft and helpless and a little wrecked around the edges. That is actually a fair point. Above them, the storm had finally quieted into drizzle. The emergency radio crackled once more before Mr. Duffy's exhausted but very alive voice filtered through. All clear for shelter B. Repeat, all clear. Watch for debris and downlines. Reality, apparently, had arrived. Rude. Neither of them moved immediately, because of course they did not. Leaving meant daylight. Daylight meant consequences. Birch Street. Aunt June's house. Small-town stairs. The terrifying possibility that whatever had just happened underground might not fit as easily above it. Caleb seemed to understand that too, because his hands had not left Ethan's arms. Gentle. Steady. Like maybe he was waiting to see if Ethan would bolt again. Fair, honestly. Ethan looked down once, at Caleb's fingers against his sleeves, at the physical proof that some people really did hold on differently the second time. Then, before fear could reclaim the wheel like it always had, Ethan made the most reckless decision of his life. More reckless than coming home. More reckless than their first kiss by canned ravioli. More reckless, perhaps, than emotionally engaging with tornadoes at all. He reached up and took Caleb's hand. Fully. Deliberately. No storm required. Caleb actually went still. Ethan, I know. Ethan said quickly, because if Caleb finished that sentence first, Ethan might spontaneously combust from vulnerability. I know I left. His voice shook, But for once, he did not hide it. And I know sorry does not magically fix 3 years of damage. And I know I do not deserve for you to just, he exhaled hard. But I am really tired, Caleb. Caleb's face changed instantly. Tired? Ethan nodded, eyes stinging for entirely too many reasons. Of running. Of assuming leaving is the same thing as protecting. Of acting like wanting something means I automatically ruin it. His grip tightened, small but certain. I do not know what happens next. I do not know what Birch Street looks like, or whether this town still has room for me, or whether he swallowed. But for the first time in a really long time, Caleb's voice was barely above a breath. Yeah. Ethan looked at him then. Really looked. At the boy he had loved. At the man still standing here. At the impossible, terrifying shape of hope. I kinda want to find out. Silence. Then Caleb Hayes, disaster in flannel, first love, unfinished story, smiled like sunrise after weather severe enough to rewrite landscapes. Not smug. Not sarcastic. Just real. Good, he said softly, thumb brushing once across Ethan's knuckles like punctuation on a promise. Because I am not letting go this time. And somehow, Ethan believed him. They stepped out of Shelter B together just after midnight into a town scattered with branches, broken signs, and rain-washed ruin. Hayes Creek looked battered. Changed. Standing, though. Kind of like them. Emergency lights flashed down Main Street. Neighbors called to each other. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked like the apocalypse had personally offended him. Ethan barely had time to take one full breath of storm-cooled air before Caleb's phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. Caleb frowned, checking the screen. Then his entire body went unnervingly still. What? Ethan asked, pulse immediately misbehaving again. Caleb looked up slowly, all warmth gone from his face. It is Birch Street. Ethan's stomach dropped. What happened? Caleb's voice